We have come to tonight's main event, which is the inspiration that gave me the idea. Am I using the word inspiration correctly?
Absolutely.
The inspiration.
It all has to do with breathing.
That gave me the idea to contact Lenn about this. Part of the reason I did is because I really got a lot out of it when he was here 20 years ago. And I thought, well, Lenn is probably bored and is dying to come to Southern Illinois. That thought I did not have. But anyway, I decided I would like to see him again, and then he and I got to talking, and it grew into what you've been through today. And so it's looking back on this book, but I would say more broadly on Lenn's achievement as a philosopher and as among the most respected religious studies professors alive in the world. When Alan mentions it's recognized by some people, even if not by the mainstream. It's recognized by some people how much Lenn has accomplished in his career. And the only thing I can say is go out and look at his CV and choose the book that that appeals to you most. There's surely going to be one in there. I became aware of him because we had a student in common, a student who had studied with me in Oklahoma, then studied with Lenn at Vanderbilt, and he's the one who brought Lenn up here the first time.
Yeah, we did a collaborations conference.
That's right, that's right. You and Jason were here for Rob Hahn's collaboration conference. Anyway, they stayed here, that particular student is now a tenured professor at the University of New Brunswick in Fredericton, New Brunswick. Yeah, I visited him there a year or two ago. Actually, just as COVID began. I had to get back into the country from Maine as a result of this. From New Brunswick into Maine. But you know, in Maine they don't care. The border crossings.
You can generalize that.
I recommend.
Yeah, not just border crossings.
Yeah, I recommend the border crossings in Maine if Gilead ever comes to be. For those of you who saw The Handmaid's Tale, I'm guessing that even in Gilead, the border border guards don't care if you come and go in Maine. They're so used to it. I mean, Maine is quasi-Canada anyway. So. All right, that said, I have wandered away from Lenn's great contributions to philosophy and to religious studies. One of the things that marks out Lenn's career as being extraordinary has to do with, and I said this in part of my paper that I didn't read, his knowledge of the ancient world, both religious and philosophical, is sweeping. It's just incredible, the range of his understanding of the ancient world. But it doesn't stop with the ancient world. Then it becomes the medieval world. And his command of the medieval world is unmatched in my experience. And it doesn't stop there. Then there's the modern world. And then there's what happened in the 20th century, and Lenn sort of got off the train somewhere when analytic philosophy took over the 20th century.
Happy man.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a dangerous thing. It takes courage to do what Lenn did, which is, without standing against what was good about the fads that were taking over philosophy, without standing against what they had right, he nevertheless insisted on a broader view, a wider understanding of methodology, that history needs to be paid attention to, and that you're not going to understand yourself well if you don't understand yourself whole, W-H-O-L-E. And so one of the things that I have to say, this is the first thing of Lenn's I read in defense of truth, which I have to say, the title of it scares me, because usually what people mean by this word is not what Lenn means by this word. I would say this is in defense of the truth, as distinct from the way that analytic philosophers tend to use this and bat this concept about. And so he calls it pluralistic, a pluralistic approach. And this is part of the reason I just assume you're a pluralist.
I was talking about pluralism of outlook. That we
Well,
should.
that's what I meant.
Oh, okay. I went and looked up during the break. I looked up all the references to Democritus, and there are references to Democritus in there, but I wasn't talking about metaphysical pluralism.
Yeah, I thought you were talking about someone's talking plurality of worlds.
It's not that.
Just before coming here, I was writing against the idea of the multiverse.
Yeah. Well,
That's right, I heard you say that.
Yeah, I'm opposed to the multiverse too. That's not what I meant by pluralism. I meant something much more, how should I put it, traditional and solid than that. But in any case, the word pluralism gets used in a lot of different ways these days. So I started a journal with John Shook called The Pluralist, but we weren't talking about the multiverse either. No. So anyway, well, this much said.
Religious pluralism, yeah. In other words, religious
there's just
pluralism,
no way that you're not a pluralist.
Well, no, because what I meant here
Yeah.
was that you can respect other people's religion without becoming a religious relativist, which is what a lot of the people
Sure.
in religious studies assume. If you're going to take somebody else's religion seriously, you better abandon all religion and join all religions at the same time, which I don't think is very coherent.
No, okay. So when I said Lenn was a pluralist, I meant it in the sense that he really is one, but that doesn't necessarily mean whatever is in your head about pluralism or what was in mine. But in any case, I don't think it was an irresponsible assertion. So that said, Lenn is now going to do what Lenn does, which is he's going to be a perfect gentleman, and he's going to correct all of us because Lenn is firm. And we are now to be subjected to firmness, but also brilliance. So make Lenn Goodman feel welcome.
Thank you so much, Randall. It's such a pleasure to be back here after so many years in your home and among your friends and colleagues and compatriots on the wire and those who will be watching when this thing gets posted. I really value so strongly and appreciate being taken seriously as a philosopher. This is represented in Alan's brilliant review of the original appearance of Coming to Mind. I also have to give credit to Greg, not just to Greg, but to Greg's wife, who thought of this wonderful title. You remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was she the one who put the
subtitle? No.
Oh, okay.
He did that.
Okay.
No, but Coming to Mind was Caroline's
Yeah.
idea. And the other thing I have to tell you, I love this cover.
I do.
The Steinberg cartoon. I told the publisher, which was University of Chicago Press, that I loved that cartoon. I had it on my door for a long time at my office in Hawaii, and they said, "Oh, I don't know if we can. I don't think we can get that." And then weeks later, they sent me the proofs of the cover design, and there it was. And I was blown away because they had indicated that they couldn't really attain it. They had to agree with the Steinberg estate to do it in the same proportions as the original and not crop it and not change it, which they did by putting in that gray matter around it. Gray matter is a good topic for all of us today, right? Yeah, the Steinberg cartoon. I've also since encountered 2 or 3 different ways of reading that cartoon, which is characteristic of Steinberg. We can talk about that later. I want to say a little bit about Alan Middleman's brilliant response to Coming to Mind. He was very fair and very accurate, and he wrote with characteristic openness. He motivated that openness earlier this evening by saying that he wanted to protect certain values that he holds dear because he finds attractions in the alternatives to those values. And that's characteristic of all of Allen's writings. He takes very seriously the integrity of those that he criticizes and opposes. I'm not among those people. Allen and I are close together philosophically, but it's a hallmark of his writing that he takes very seriously the philosophers that he regards as a threat to the core values, metaphysical, ethical, spiritual, social, that he holds dear. And I think that's a model to be emulated. I was very fortunate to have, as a collaborator in this project, working side by side, sitting at my desk, and in the writing of that book, the knowledge that Greg Karamenico has of brain science, you've witnessed that today in all that he's done in the past 10 years in reviewing what's been happening since we wrote that book. But having that deep knowledge, that deep appreciation, and that incredible memory that Greg has. Greg
It was better then.
we were all better then, but you know, we age. But you know, Greg, if we wrote all of it together, but the chapter on memory is very much his, because memory was a special topic for him from long before we conceived of this book. The chapter on creativity reflects values of mind. Again, we wrote all of this together, but I want to call out the chapter on creativity for you today because of the sponsorship of the program and because creativity itself is so dear to my heart. And if there's time, I'll say something about imagination and creativity and why, since the time of Immanuel Kant, the term imagination has become a kind of euphemism for creativity in a similar way to the way that mind has become a euphemism for the soul. So I'll give you that as a kind of foretaste of some things I want to say. I can't take Chalmers all that seriously. As you read the book itself, and I know some of you are reading it, you'll see why I don't think the strong version of emergence is much different from the weak version. I think we have to go back to John Stuart Mill, who devised the concept of emergent. He did not use that term. It was developed by later thinkers whose feet were really resting on biology to a great extent. But Mill was, in writing his logic, Mill wanted to include inductive logic. Nothing on that scale had ever been done before. Nothing even close to it before Francis Bacon. He wanted to explain what inductive logic was and why we need it. What Mill considered to be inductive logic is what we would now call, somewhat apologetically, scientific method. I was a colleague for years in Hawaii with Larry Loudon, who didn't think there is a scientific method. But Mill put a technique of doing science on the books, and it cannot be done deductively, and that was part of Mill's point, and that was how he introduced, and why he introduced the concept of emergence, not the term. The basic idea that Mill wanted to put across was that there are some concepts that cannot be deduced from others. The classic examples come from chemistry, and he gave examples from chemistry himself. My favorite example is about table salt that I mentioned earlier today. You take chlorine, which is a green poisonous gas, and you combine it chemically, not physically, with sodium, which is a highly reactive grayish metal, and you get table salt. table salt is neither a poisonous gas, nor green, nor metal. It's crystalline in structure, and it's the necessity of life rather than being a poison. The properties are completely different, and you cannot deduce those properties from the constituents that made it up. That makes emergence important to Mill because it shows that you can't work deductively with that kind of transformation that occurs in nature and which occurs in the laboratory and even in the kitchen. Thus marking the boundary between deduction and induction, where you have to use what we, at least for a time, would call scientific method instead of deductive reasoning. The concept of emergence was important to later philosophers, including Greg and me, because we do not think that the higher order properties of some kinds of beings can be deduced from the properties of their constituents or their predecessors. If you believe, as I do, that Darwin was right about evolution, that would mean that we are descended from other primates. It would not mean that we are essentially apes, that we have an inner, there was a book years ago about the inner reptile in all of us. Remember that one? We don't have an inner reptile of us, but we do have that ancestry. Human nature is not reducible to that ancestry. That's what emergence is about when you talk about it in terms of nature rather than just in terms of logic. I think that's an important point. I want to say one word about deduction, and if you do take the trouble to read this book, read the chapter on context, and you'll see why there's an ambiguity about the term deduction. If you know that table salt is made out of sodium and chlorine, you can deduce from that understanding that if you combine sodium and chlorine, you will get table salt. Okay? You can deduce that. Notice that in order to deduce it, you have to have that knowledge. You have to not only have that knowledge, but make an assumption out of that knowledge. The background knowledge that you assume determines what you can deduce and what you cannot. So from the mere definition of sodium and chlorine, you can deduce nothing of the sort. But from the knowledge of the chemical capabilities of those elements, then you can deduce the derivation of table salt. That point is a very important point, somehow grievously overlooked by the man who was, in my time at Harvard and long since, considered the most important philosopher in the English-speaking world. I'm talking about Quine, who wrote his famous essay, Two Dogmas of Empiricism, where he tried to make a paradox out of the fact that analyticity and synonymy and all sorts of things of that nature aren't really workable and can't be defined without circularity. The paradox that Quine was playing with was an untoward result of his inability to see that what you assume is going to determine what you can deduce. Okay? So once you know, I'll give you Kant's example. Kant's example was about, and it's an example that will get undergraduates scratching their heads if they get that far in Kant. Kant's example was about
gold is
matter.
metal.
No, I was thinking about matter.
Oh.
You see, matter is extended. Kant thought that was an analytic proposition. That matter has mass, Kant says, is a synthetic proposition. Why the hell did Kant say that when all our high school students are taught to define matter as that which takes up space and has mass? The reason is that Kant was interested in the fact that Newton conceived of the idea of mass and recognized that all matter has mass, and therefore made that what our high school students now are taught is part of the definition of matter. So to the high school graduate who encounters that sentence in Kant, they don't understand why it's synthetic proposition that matter has mass, but an analytic proposition that matter is extended. It's an analytic proposition because that was how Descartes defined matter. It's a synthetic proposition because that was what Newton discovered about matter. Once that discovery is canonized and made part of the assumption about what the definition of matter is, that proposition is no longer synthetic. It becomes analytic because that background knowledge has been incorporated into the assumptions that you're making. Okay? So what's deducible and what's not deducible, this relates directly to emergence, you see. What's deducible and what's not deducible is dependent entirely on what background assumptions you're bringing to the definitions and assumptions that you're making. So, Aristotle taught us that man is a social animal, zoon politikon, one who lives in a civic society, a civil society. We're not really fully human if we live in isolation like the Cyclops. Interesting. You see what Aristotle learned from Homer? When you go to the museum and you see Aristotle contemplating the bust of Homer, part of what Aristotle learned from Homer is that the Cyclops is not fully human because he's not civilized, because he doesn't live in a civil society, because he doesn't have a culture, he doesn't have a social setting, he doesn't have that interaction with other human beings, he doesn't have that selfhood, which is so much a part not just of our individuality, which it is, but also of our second-person capabilities. Okay? Please notice that, because I think that the spurious paradox that Quine introduced into dogmatism and empiricism is spurious because of the fact that he neglects to inform you about which background assumptions one is going to incorporate into the armamentum that one is going to use from which to make one's deductions. You make the deductions without those assumptions, the deductions will look impossible. It's that which makes the so-called difficult problem difficult or impossible, not just difficult, but impossible, not just hard, but unfeasible. If you bracket your actual knowledge about what kind of an organism we are, think about it for a minute. If you tried to write a biology of ants, as Wilson did, the biology of ants wouldn't really make it as good biology if it neglected the fact that these ants are social creatures. How could you write a biology of human beings while neglecting the fact that we live in societies, that we use language, that we have culture, that we have religious beliefs and all kinds of other characteristics which are distinctively human, right? You wouldn't be doing a very good job of human biology. You'd be misrepresenting the case. And just as if you had represented ants as just in terms of their anatomy and their physiology, and neglected the fact, hey, some of these ants are sterile and only one of them can produce fertile eggs. Interesting, isn't it? Let's move on. There's an argument, and this is my only criticism of Allen's paper, there's an argument that I think Allen took too seriously, which emanates from Plantinga. I don't take Chalmers too seriously. I rarely take Plantinga too seriously. I think he did a good job with the other minds problem, comparing the other minds problem to the existence of God. Please notice, however, that his argument about the existence of God being analogous to the discovery of the existence of other minds, please notice that that's a dialectical argument. The great Al-Farabi would have called that kalam. It's apologetic. I was at a conference a couple weeks ago where apologetics was treated with great respect, but a dialectical argument is not an argument which will work with people who don't share your premises. Plantinga was arguing to a friendly crowd. Even his argument that the existence of God is like the existence of other minds. Dialectical struck a fair blow, because the philosophers against whom he was arguing took the problem of other minds very seriously, did not take the problem of the existence of God very seriously, and he was pointing out, legitimately pointing out, an analogy there. However, Plantinga's argument against evolution is not only dialectical in that sense that it's weaker than a really rigorous argument, it is also, how shall I say this nicely, it's weak. It's very weak. And its weakness is based on the fact that Plantinga fails to distinguish evolutionary biology from the beliefs of certain evolutionary psychologists. I have to credit Greg here for teaching me about the extremes to which evolutionary psychologists have gone. I joked about it earlier by saying they think that people enjoy Darwin because they have this evolutionary need for survival and reproducing, to know what to do if somebody gives them a clump of gold from the Rhine River, etc., etc. That was meant to be a humorous reductio ad absurdum of evolutionary psychology. Please make a distinction between the theory of evolution, which says that we get our various physiological functions by inheritance from ancestors who resembled us in certain ways and had a certain traits that were A, heritable, and B, advantageous to them in terms of their survival and reproduction. You can measure that degree of advantage in terms of the fertility of those lineages, and it's been demonstrated mathematically that the lineages that have even a very slight numerical advantage in survival and reproducing will eventually become the norm in the species. So the lineages, the individuals that Aristotle thought were just sports of nature and don't really count in defining a species, those marginal cases can turn out to be very important if the trait they have is A, heritable, and B, advantageous or disadvantageous, as the case may be. They will become, in the advantageous case, they will become, in the course of a surprisingly short number of generations, the norm, the usual case in the species. That's an important piece of mathematics. It was not demonstrated by Darwin, it was assumed by him. It was demonstrated by R.A. Fisher and other genetic statisticians around the turn of the century, into the 20s and 30s. The confusion that Plantinga was making was to accuse those who were arguing against him of falling into a kind of a trap because their argumentation was a product, according to their own account, of evolutionary psychology, that they had inherited a penchant for those beliefs, which by their own account came to them by evolution. Since evolution can't guarantee you that your reasoning is going to be sound or truth developing or whatever phrase you want to use, they couldn't really sustain the claim that their inferences were sound and that Plantinga was saying their inferences could just as well be completely cockeyed, they might be completely wrong. Since they were products of inheritance, they had no rational reason to believe them rather than, or to affirm them, rather than to affirm some alternative. Please notice that in making that case, that case is what you would call in formal terms is a tu quoque. You yourself are tu quoque means you yourself. You yourself are being irrational because, by your own account, your beliefs are held on grounds which are not productive of truth. They are grounds which are just the product of your genetic evolutionary inheritance. Please notice the distinction. between evolution itself and evolutionary psychology. Evolution itself is not about where you got your beliefs. It's not about what the basis, the psychological penchant that you might have for adopting a certain belief. Evolution is about where you got your capacities, including the capacity to reason. And it doesn't guarantee, Quest is right about this, it doesn't guarantee that your capacity to reason is infallible. I don't think anybody ever claimed that. There are good logicians who have made honest mistakes. There were also, in the past, in the sophists, we find pretty good logicians who made dishonest logical mistakes. That happens. We have means of correcting those errors the same as we have means of correcting empirical errors. That is what logic on the one hand and scientific method on the other are all about. We have means of detecting and exposing and correcting such errors. Plantinga was turning his tu quoque into an ad hominem. All right? He was accusing people of grounding their beliefs on their genetic inheritance. That's not what they were doing. They were grounding their beliefs on what they thought made sense. We could differ about whether evolution is not right or is right. The grounds for evolution are pretty impressive. They involve what Quirrell in Darwin's time called consilience, a term which E.O. Wilson actually made the title of a somewhat polemical book. Consilience being the fact that evidence from a lot of different sources, whether it's fossil evidence or embryonic evidence or geographical evidence, or nowadays we have a kind of feature in DNA evidence, all points in the same direction. That's the kind of reasoning which Mill considered to be inductive. Aristotle credits Socrates with discovering the general logical form of induction, and the inductive method nowadays. I think people worry that induction will be confused with mere enumeration. You could find out how many people there are in this room and do that inductively, but induction is much more intuitive than that. Aristotle gives the example of seeing somebody in the agora who is using certain body language and going up to somebody else and talking to him in a certain way, and you can tell by the way he's talking, Aristotle says, that he's touching his friend for a loan. Okay? Now that is not an infallible inference, but it could be a perfectly sound inference. One might even call it a logical inference, although it's not a deductive piece of logic. Another example that he gives is the Socratic type of induction, which is always intuitive, and which gives you the premises that you need to make a deductive syllogism into a sound scientific argument. Another example that he gives is a piece of induction about where the moon gets its light. Aristotle says, we know that the moon gets its light from the sun because the moon is always illuminated on the side where the sun set. Okay? You might not have noticed it before, but people who did notice it made that inference. In this case, we think they're right. In the case of the agora and the fellow who's talking to his friend, he may have gotten it right, he may not. It's intuitive, it's inductive nonetheless. Notice, please, as Errol Harris points out in his brilliant book, Hypothesis and Perception, that that kind of induction does not amount to amassing tons of evidence of cases that all look the same. Aristotle understood that point. Darwin was criticized at the time of the publication of The Origin of Species for not operating by enumerating cases and counting up the cases and seeing which were the more likely. And that's true, he was not. He was using a method of consilience. He brought together bodies of evidence that all pointed in the same direction. And today, because people are a little embarrassed by the word induction, they often use the word inference to best explanation. Sometimes they use the word abduction. It doesn't really matter. The point is that you're putting together the information that you have to draw an inference that goes beyond the information that you have. Please notice that that's the distinguishing characteristic of induction as opposed to deduction. In deduction, you're always relying on the information that you started out with. In induction, you're trying to press beyond it to go further. I could talk about that more later if there's time. There's a marvelous passage, I talk about it at some length in the Defense of Truth, in the chapter on induction. A marvelous passage in the very end of the Posterior Analytics by Aristotle. It's at Book 2, Chapter 19, about Becker, page 100a. I call it a Homeric simile, and as I say, if there's time, I'll spell out the simile for you about his conception. There's going to have to be time because we're going to have to talk about generalization, the issue that Randy raised. I'll talk about how we get to generalize in the form of what we now call law-like generalizations, which are a little stronger than the kind that I think Randy wanted to leave room for. We'll come back to that. The important thing to remember about Plantinga's argument against Darwin is that he was conflating evolutionary psychology with natural evolution by natural selection. Those two have to be kept separate. That was an equivocation. And I'll remark to you that the great physician Galen, who thought that nobody could be a great physician if he wasn't a good philosopher, Galen said that all fallacies rest on equivocation. In this case, the equivocation of treating evolution as though it stood for the same thing as evolutionary psychology. Okay, so we're going to differentiate those two. I guess I should turn to Randy's remarks about generalization. There are two kinds of generalization, and one kind is going to be, he wants to say probabilistic. I might be inclined to say problematic, because when you generalize, you could get into trouble if your sample size isn't big enough, if your sample size isn't representative enough, or if I'm going to be real Aristotelian about it, you can get into trouble if you don't base your generalization on essential characteristics of things. A good example of an Aristotelian generalization is that all animals with backbones have hearts. All animals with backbones have hearts. That could have been gotten by just dissecting a lot of animals, and whichever ones had backbones, you'd check and see if they had a heart. That would be a lousy way to do it. You'd never have time to dissect enough animals. You'd never know whether there was an exception, and you'd be in the position of the person who thought that all swans were white because he'd never seen a black swan. Black swans originally came from Australia, to the best of my knowledge, so there were lots of people who never saw a black swan. Nowadays, you can see them in a nice collection of swans, but if you're generalizing with insufficient data, you're going to be in trouble. Please notice that Aristotle's example, all animals with backbones have hearts, is not liable, is not vulnerable to the same kind of objection. And the reason is that that generalization is based on an understanding of what it is to be an animal with a backbone. That is, it's based on an understanding of the physiology of the animals. What in particular? Well, animals that are without a backbone, they were named by Lamarck. Lamarck always gets a bad rap for thinking that he didn't really think that giraffes got long necks by stretching to reach the trees. But he was a great biologist, and his specialty was invertebrates. He coined the word invertebrate because he didn't want to be known as the professor of worms. And Lamarck Lamarck had the privilege of working with invertebrates quite a bit, and the characteristic of invertebrates is that they do not have backbones. And if you ask yourself the question, we had one of our speakers just earlier talk about exoskeletons and endoskeletons and exohearts and you know, etc. The characteristic of invertebrates is that they tend to be limited in size, and they tend, therefore, to have a limited need for a circulatory system. When you get to the level of vertebrate animals, you get to the point where you need a certain, much more efficient circulatory system, and for that reason, you're going to have a heart. You're not going to get to be a vertebrate without having a heart. If you understand the biology of that situation, you will understand why Aristotle's generalization is not just based on cutting up a bunch of vertebrates to see if they've also got a heart. It's based on understanding the biology of the vertebrate. Similarly, I'll take the famous, all men are mortal. Why are all human beings mortal? If you understand what it is to be a human being, you'll know that we have a metabolism, that metabolism is a series of processes that achieve a certain homeostasis, that all such processes have a built-in inefficiency to them and a built-in entropy into them. And once you understand, Aristotle didn't know Lord Kelvin's work about the second law of thermodynamics, but once you understand the way metabolism and biological processes work, you'll know why it's inevitable that all animals that are human, or mammals in general, can't live forever, because those processes eventually are going to run down. It's the very same sort of reasoning that would lead Einstein, if he was working in the patent office, they would not issue a patent for a perpetual motion machine. There can't be a perpetual motion machine because the latent, inevitable inefficiency of any mechanical process is going to lead eventually to the machine running down. That's what's going to happen. That's what makes it necessary that all human beings are mortal. Aristotle had an intuitive understanding of that without knowing of the law of entropy and without knowing the second law of thermodynamics as a demonstrated philosophical truth, or physical truth, excuse me. But if you have the idea that an organism runs with a certain inefficiency, with a limited efficiency below 100%, you will know that these animals can't live forever, that we are an example of such animals, and that we can't live forever, and that's the way you get that kind of thing. Now, I submit that generalizations of that kind, which are apologetically called law-like, are called law-like because they represent laws of nature. The people who coined that language, law-like, were embarrassed by the talk of natural laws. They didn't like the idea that nature was somehow personified as issuing laws which everything within nature had to obey. That kind of anthropomorphism maybe survives in certain kinds of language. We talk about Mother Nature and so forth, but I don't think anybody today who does use the term natural law is under that delusion. I think that the term is perfectly respectable. I think that there are laws of nature, and I'll say one thing to motivate the claim that there aren't laws of nature. This is addressed to Randy's paper. When Kepler determined, using Tycho Brahe's observations, that the orbits of the planets are elliptical, they're not that different from circles, It's a very slight difference. It's not an ellipse like you draw on the blackboard for kids in elementary school to show them the difference between an ellipse and a circle. They're very slightly elliptical, but when Kepler found that the orbits of the planets are elliptical, that left a certain mystery in cosmology. The mystery was, in classical medieval cosmology, the planets were supposed to, not only was it geocentric, but they were supposed to be embedded in crystalline spheres, which were indestructible and invisible because they were transparent. Always had been and always would be, not subject to natural processes, not subject to generation or decay. And the problem that was left behind by Kepler was, hey, these ellipses, what keeps the planets where they are? Why don't they just fall or spin off into space? And it was something like 150 years before Newton came up with an answer to that question. Newton did some measurements which led him to be able to formulate the law of universal gravitation. And I stress that the law of universal gravitation does not say that if you throw something up in the air it's going to fall down. It does not say that the apple must fall from the tree. The law of universal gravitation says that all bodies have mass and that these masses attract one another with a force. Please notice that the notion of mass was a new concept that was introduced by Newton. The concept of force meant action at a distance, which was lampooned by Cartesians who thought that the world has to work mechanically and there can't be action at a distance. All bodies have mass which attracts their masses which attract one another, directly proportional to the mass and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. That's a remarkable thing to be able to figure out. But the amazing thing about that, and it was not probabilistic, was that you could then project that knowledge beyond the terrestrial realm and determine that the behavior of the heavenly bodies, which used to be thought of as being made out of a completely different kind of matter, which was indestructible and so forth, and glowed by themselves, these heavenly bodies keep the elliptical orbits that they have because of two forces. One was the force of gravitation, which prevented them from flying off into space, and one was the force of the Newtonian inertia, which kept them going on, and the ellipse was the result of those two forces. The ellipse was the result of those two forces. So if you draw an ellipse in geometry class and you see that it has two foci and there are two lines, you can make those two lines that go from the focus to the outer boundary of the ellipse. You can make those two lines to be vectors representing those two forces, gravitation and what we like fondly to call centrifugal force, which is the force of the Newtonian carrying on the same line that they were in. The ellipse is the result of those two forces, and the amazing achievement of Newton was to be able to explain the behavior of the planets and the moon by the same laws that govern the behavior of terrestrial objects here on Earth. One of the great discoveries of Kant, his name has come up from several times, Kant and about simultaneously Laplace made a similar conjecture, which turned out to be correct, about what were previously called nebulae. Nebulae were originally cloudy bodies. They were thought to be stars, very, very, very distant stars that looked a little blurry. And those stars turned out to be galaxies. If we look at them more closely now with better telescopes, we can see that these stars are not stars at all, but whole populations of stars comparable, bigger or smaller or similar to our own Milky Way, the cluster of stars, the billions of stars among which we live. what was interesting to Kant about that discovery is that, like Newton, he had determined that the same laws of gravitation and motion and the swirling motion of those bodies, and many of the galaxies have that kind of shape to them, the same laws that govern the behavior of the planets in the solar system govern the behavior of the stars in the galaxies, which were once thought to be those whole galaxies. They're called galaxies because they were milk-like. That's what they look like. They're called nebulae because they were cloudy-looking. They turned out to be obeying the same kind of laws that we know with the small objects that Newton experimented with and that Galileo had experimented with before him here on Earth. I think that the ability to project that finding from the terrestrial realm to the celestial realm is a triumph of science, and a triumph that depended upon recognizing that the same laws, they're not probabilistic, they're the same basic necessities, they're not logical necessities, they're causal necessities based on the various kinds of matter and the kinds of forces that are operative throughout the cosmos. I'm going to say just one or two more things. Question of whether consciousness or any mental activity can be explained or not. That goes back to the issue of the hard problem of consciousness, the hard problem of this or that. The hard problem is supposed to be that you can't, the easy problem is that you can't predict what would happen. The hard problem is that you can't explain what would happen just based on the givens. A lot depends on what you mean by explanation. Please watch out for squishy words like that, because they open the door to equivocation. I remind you of what Galen said. All fallacies are based on equivocation, using the same word in multiple senses in the same argument. If you count reduction as the only kind of explanation, then a lot of that stuff about consciousness will be inexplicable. It will be inexplicable because you're going to try to reduce the subjective. That was the what it is like. What is like? Interesting phrase. Call your attention to that language too. You know, when there's a tornado, the news people show up and the first thing they do is they stick a microphone under the nose of somebody whose house has been just devastated, and they say to that person, what did it feel like for you to see your house go up in smoke, or in cinders, or whatever it went up in? They're looking for the subjective expression, what did it feel like, because that makes good news, right? Not good news, really. Sensationalist, yellow journalism kind of news, but we get a lot of that. But the what is it like is looking for subjectivity. If you're looking for subjectivity, the idea that you're going to explain subjectivity in objective terms is leading you down a primrose path. You're not going to be able to do it. If explanation means reduction, and reduction is achieved by turning what is essentially and inherently subjective into something that is experientially known to be not subjective, right? If you're going to be turning subjective experience into the behavior of molecules or something like that, it can't be done. Of course it can't be done. That's a false issue. Don't be taken in by the idea that the inability to explain something which can't be explained by reduction to terms inherently incompatible with what you started out with. Don't be taken in by the notion that therefore you've got something inexplicable. Maybe consciousness has to be explained in its own terms. That's what Spinoza said. Spinoza respected that idea from Descartes. Consciousness has its own terms. I remember reading an article by the Israeli psychologist who was writing about child psychology. And he wrote something about Freud's psychology. Freud, when he started out, Freud, as you know, was a physician. And he wanted to explain everything physiologically. A noble ambition. But he found that the kind of phenomena that he needed to explain could not be explained physiologically, and he changed the nature of the language and explanation that he used. Early on in his career, he started talking about the ego and the id and the superego, terms that all related to various kinds of consciousness or subconsciousness, always in the realm of the subjective. He did not feel that he could any longer succeed in doing the kind of psychological work he wanted to do by explaining things. Bruno Bettelheim is the psychologist I'm talking about, wrote about Freud in this vein. He could not really get anywhere unless he started explaining things in terms of desires and ambitions and hopes and fears and other subjective phenomena. And maybe some subjective phenomena, like dreams, could be explained in terms of other subjective phenomena, like fears or guilts or whatever. I'm not endorsing everything that Freud ever said, but I do endorse his recognition that that type of reduction, that type of explanation by way of reduction that he had started out looking for, was never going to occur. To him, it appeared maybe one of these days it would occur. But you know, if you look at the logic of the case, it wasn't a question of one of these days. He was trying to determine what kind of an apple is an orange, and you have to recognize that an apple is not any kind of an orange. You have to treat the subjective in its own terms. What it's like to be a bat, or what it's like to be a child, or what it's like to be one of the members of the Khoisan people of Southern Africa, that's a matter of their experience. And the best way to find out is to ask them. That's why we have language. We won't always get a truthful answer, but at least we'll get an answer. I'll go back to my basic point. Now, just before that basic point, I'll close with the idea of persons. Randi recognized rightly that persons are very important in the account that we're giving. I don't think that personhood, for the reasons that Greg and others have stated, I don't think that personhood stands in adequately for the notion of soul, but it does point in the right direction. I will tell you, since there was a nice plug by Randi for my book on justice, my ethical system is based on personhood. It's based on the concept of deserts. I believe that all beings have deserts and deserve to be treated as what they are. I believe that persons have a special kind of deserts which can be expressed in terms of rights and in terms of dignity. We don't give rights to animals, and I don't think we should, but animals do have deserts. The experimental animals that we used have to be treated in terms of what they are, not potential persons, not babies, but sentient beings that do suffer and whose suffering needs to be taken account of. I believe that trees and ecosystems, I believe that monuments of nature and culture, eco-niches, all these entities have deserts and need to be treated as what they are, but persons have their deserts because of their subjectivity and their freedom, their reason, their ability to consider, to hope, to have plans and hopes and dreams. That is how we treat the desert. That is how beings that are persons deserve to be treated. And I like to note that when I speak of persons, I'm not necessarily speaking only of human persons. If there are persons in other worlds, they also deserve, if they have those characteristics of thought and awareness and so forth, freedom, sensitivity, they too have desserts. It doesn't depend on how much they look like us, it depends on what they are, which is the very essence of those beings. They're conatus, as I like to put it, using Spinoza's term. Soul is real, I'll sum up. Souls are real because souls are active. They are interactive, they are social, but they are not reducible to their social being. They are very much invested in the body. I do not think that the defense of soul, as I've offered it in the book that Greg and I have written together, I do not think that this defense of soul is going to help all that much with the argument about the rights of the unborn. I think the unborn have rights. I think that the comatose, I think that people in other nations have rights. I think it's interesting that John Rawls, who gets credit for having a very elaborate theory of justice, is not able to defend the acronychs and the other species and so forth, except by way of saying, well, this prudential sort of argument, we don't know that the rainforest in Brazil won't contain the cure for cancer. That's not the basis on which to defend the rainforest in Brazil. The Amazon rainforest should be defended because of its intrinsic value, because of what it is, not because of what it might do for us. So I think my general theory of desserts is very helpful here, and in the human case, it is based on human personhood. So the notion of persons is very central in my thinking, and it was, of course, central in the thinking that Greg and I in which Greg and I anchored our account of the human being. I emphasize that souls are not a quasi-physical thing. They are not something which we call spiritual because we think they can walk through walls. Walking through walls is something which is both physical and non-physical, and that's nonsensical. Souls are non-physical because they are a different order of being, emergent from and not reducible to the body in which they reside, and from which, in my belief, which is Aristotelian, that they are inseparable. Soul is to body here, as seaworthiness is to a ship. I think that's a good place to stop. Thank you very much for listening to this. Okay, I'm at your mercy. Go ahead, Randy.
Yes, the attack on radical empiricism, which was a very gentlemanly defense of rationalism, in my view. You realize that the orbits of the planets are not, in fact, elliptical. This is my reference to Gauss. That he waited until he was dead to publish that because he knew what would happen if he told the world that the discovery of Uranus depended not upon some geometry, but upon segmenting in the right unit little pieces of the orbits of the other planets, and realizing that the perturbations, of course this happened again when Neptune was discovered, and realizing there is no geometry of the solar system. There is no law of gravitation. There is no law of, so it's not, there's no such thing as mass and there's no such thing as force.
Well, mass is not a thing.
What there are concepts that are useful for grouping lots of things that are really different under headings that are not so different, because the differences among the things so grouped don't make such a great difference. Except that it led to a meltdown in the German Academy, which was the worst academic argument in all of history, I feel confident. It destroyed the German university because Gauss had essentially asserted, and I would say proven to my satisfaction.
You can't say proven, I mean, you gotta say
proven, not deductively.
No.
He had demonstrated in the sense of, I show you this. That the idea that the solar system had to have some geometrical form is not how you discover that Uranus exists as a planet.
Let's leave Uranus aside just for a moment. Start with whether the position I advocated for was rationalist. I agree that there's a good rationalist component to it. I do not agree that Kepler's geometry was somehow imposed on the solar system. I think if we have to regard that geometry as an approximation, that's fair enough. And then there are other factors which influence the orbits. It's not a perfect system, but geometry is a kind of approximation. If you want my own description of how I would describe the epistemology that I'm using, I would say that it is both rationalistic and empiricist, and I don't think that there is an incompatibility between those two types of epistemology. I think that's a false notion which is derived from overstating the claims of rationalism, where in rationalism you have to have innate ideas, and in empiricism you can't do anything without observation of the senses, and that's going to get you.
Well, we agree.
It's going to get you nowhere. I think the great philosophers, I mentioned Aristotle, I could mention Spinoza as well. They were rationalists and empiricists at the same time, and if somebody wants to say that those positions are incompatible with each other, that person isn't thinking about logic, they're just thinking about the boxes that they were shown on the blackboard in some course or read in some
Well,
textbook.
I divide them just as Kant did into assertoric, problematic, and hypothetical, and the kind of reasoning that's involved in creating the segmented algebra that describes what the path of Uranus must be. And I do use the word must here, must be.
It's a causal must. It's not a logical or geometrical must.
Right.
It's a causal must.
That's right, but it's still just a description of where it must be. And so I do mean it causally. But my point is that hypothetically, your safest reasoning is going to be algebraic, and it's never going to be geometrical, because geometrical depends upon a sort of generalization of a kind of measurement that is a priori and deductive, and then imposing that. Now, when Whitehead created projective geometry, that changed because geometry became
Even before Whitehead, when Descartes created analytic geometry.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Because in analytic geometry, you could translate any algebraic statement into a geometrical statement and vice versa.
That's right.
That was a powerful tool,
Yeah.
a very powerful tool, because algebra was invented in the Middle Ages.
That's the good Descartes I was talking about.
That's the good Descartes.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we're getting closer to agreement here. The point is that these scientific generalizations, we can agree on that language, that these scientific generalizations are always corrigible and always refinable.
That's right.
I think the only addition I would make to the ground on which we meet is that the probabilistic statements always presuppose categorical statements. The categorical statements are corrigible, of course. They gotta be. If you say that this is where this body is located, you might find out by better measurements.
Feynman does say what you say. So, obviously he's my hero. So it's
How would you fit in the orbit of Mercury in your discussion?
well, it's the same. It's segmented. It's not the same. It's not the same every year.
What was your point?
Well, my point is the analogous situation with Uranus was present with the
They ignored it.
Precession.
Yeah, with the precession of the Earth's axis, we learned by about 11,000 BC
general relativity
that it
is
wasn't perfectly geometrical what the Earth did, and so therefore our view of Mercury was not just Mercury, but the retrograde motion of Mercury and of Mars post these.
1100 BC.
Oh, you're not gonna like
No,
this,
I mean
but it
11,000.
was only Einstein.
11,000 BC.
Okay, that's a
I'm
whole
trying
other, that's a
to-
whole other.
No, look it
conversation.
up. Not
Okay.
to Playa. That's the stone circle that was created in
All right,
11,000
all right,
BC.
but let's get together on the fact
But
that
the
we.
point is that it was always segmented, John. It was always, we just ignored it.
We have come to an understanding.
11,000. Look it up.
We have come to an understanding, and the understanding is that these measurements and the projections based on the measurements are always corrigible.
Yes.
And one of the things that makes scientific method scientific is that the corrigibility is not going to be arbitrary. It's not going to be because somebody thinks it should be this way and somebody thinks it should be that way. It's going to be because we have new evidence that suggests, okay, it's a little different.
Sounds like empiricism.
Well, there's nothing wrong with empiricism.
Yeah.
What's wrong is dogmatic empiricism, which insists that they're embarrassed about the laws of nature. That's silly. The laws of nature, whatever the laws of nature would be, it isn't that bodies usually attract each other with a force that's sort of like no, that's not how it goes.
Stronger than that.
It's a lot stronger than that, and I've been working for the past few decades on a new translation of the Guide to the Perplexed, or Maimonides, and I hope you'll all read it when it comes out in February. Maimonides makes the point, following Ghazali, the great Muslim theologian, that the laws of nature are not laws of logic, as philosophers like Avicenna thought. They are laws of nature. He calls them ordained by God. This is the order that God proposed for nature. It is not the only conceivable way it could have been. The things that exist are not all and only the things that could exist. There are things that exist, and there are things that don't exist that could have existed but don't. He ascribes this to the will of God, and his preservation of the will of God is a way of preserving empiricism in science. Because if it were all matters of necessity in a logical sense, then there wouldn't be any alternative, and you'd have the universe of a plenum, which couldn't fail to exist and couldn't fail to contain everything that it does contain, and nothing that it does contain could fail to exist, and nothing that fails to exist could have possibly existed, all by logic. That's a mistake. And introducing that idea of causal necessity as distinct from logical necessity is very, very important.
Was it not Einstein who said, I could be wrong in
You think
this?
it's who?
Einstein,
Yes.
who said, what I'd really like to know is whether or not God had any choice in the creation of the universe.
Yes.
You're saying yes.
I'm saying that Maimonides thought he could. Maimonides thought that was important because it preserved the idea that creation was an act of grace and not a necessity that occurred from all time and was eternal. He had theological reasons for that, and he also had scientific reasons for that, because he knew as a practicing physician and author of 10 medical works that not everything that exists has to exist, and not everything that could exist has to exist, etc. We have to distinguish causal necessity from natural necessity, and natural necessity is what I'm talking about when I talk about causal laws. And I stress the point because philosophers today are embarrassed by the idea they saw law-like. Look, what's the difference between a law-like generalization and a non-law-like generalization? A non-law-like generalization is that all the people in this room have two legs. You can go around the room and count the people in this room and see how many there are and see how many legs they have. But if somebody comes in who's an amputee, that generalization would suddenly be falsified. That kind of generalization is not what scientists do. Scientists have to determine the law-like ones, that is, they have this embarrassed characteristic. They're shy about saying that there are laws of nature. I'm saying there are laws of nature. We do use reason to determine them. We can't use reason exclusively deductively. It has to be informed by experience, hence the example of the black swan, etc., etc. There's a need to be open to experience, but experience is not going to contradict the basic necessities of what are determined to be laws of nature, although what we took to be laws of nature might have to be corrected on the basis of experience. And that's where empiricism and rationalism meet, and that's why these labels can be misleading. Good example was made before. The labels are misleading because they've been applied to typify, and when labels are applied to typify, they go to extremes. They emphasize the differences. Hera is only about chastity and motherhood, and Aphrodite is only about sex. No, that's not how you define the essences of things. Okay, we should hear from other people. Please.
Can you speak something about creativity in the soul?
I said I would, didn't I? I'm so
And
sorry.
imagination.
I am so sorry.
Oh yeah, and imagination too, yeah.
I
If you have
promised
time.
that. Thank you for reminding me. Okay. This was a point, Randy, where I thought you were reading too fast, I suspect. Randy said in his presentation that the book puts three headings up of chance, imitation, and inspiration. Those headings were meant to be attempted explanations of creativity, which I wanted to dismiss in the chapter that Greg and I wrote about creativity. The reason people refer to chance, typically philosophers of science refer to chance as an explanation of what you and I would call creativity, is that they don't have a deductive model for how it occurs. You think about the example of that intuition of the guy who's touching the other fellow for a loan. He makes a guess. Einstein likes to tell about it in terms of play. He talks about, in the Schultz volume, he talks about the play of the mind with various possibilities. I think Einstein is right about the freedom with which we do that kind of casting about for ideas. But Pasteur, who was another great scientist after all, said that accident is only useful to the prepared mind. Okay? You've got to have the problem, you've got to have the problem well stated, you've got to know what you're looking for, you've got to know the background. So I gave some examples in the book of discoveries, important discoveries, that were that looked like they were the result of accident, like Nobel dropping a file of nitroglycerin into some packing material. I think it was diatomaceous earth, and lo and behold, for that 11th time that it happened, he didn't blow up his own laboratory that time because the diatomaceous earth absorbed the liquid and it didn't go off, and that's how dynamite was invented. Okay. If somebody had, some idiot was just playing around with the same file of nitroglycerin in the lab at night and let himself in when he shouldn't be there, it wouldn't mean anything to him. Nobel was looking for a way of stabilizing nitroglycerin because it's very unstable, and he wanted to make it safe for use as an industrial or military explosive. He had a motive, he had a background, he was working with certain materials, he knew in advance that nitroglycerin was highly explosive, he knew its limitations in terms of its instability and so forth. The people
He was
who packed,
prepared.
what? He was a prepared mind, and even the people who packed the box knew to use, I think it was diatomaceous earth, the point being that they knew that if it was shielded in that way, it wouldn't, if somebody dropped the box, it wouldn't blow up the nitro. Well, that kind of thing is very, very important. It's not a matter of chance. It's not a matter of play. The people who are reductionist in spirit, and I think you could see from what we said earlier, that I have a distaste for reductionism. The people who are reductionistic think that there's no such thing as invention. If you can't deduce it, you must have guessed it. If you didn't guess it, you must have copied it. Well, that only pushes the question further back. Okay, who did you copy it from and how did they get the idea, right? That is not an explanation. That's an excuse for not giving an explanation. Inspiration is a nice one. I love the line quoted from Abraham Joshua Heschel. And there's a related line when he's talking about prophets. He says that I think it was an activist or something like that has a message. A prophet has a mission. Right near with the line you quoted. The idea of inspiration is a beautiful and poetic idea. The trouble is that it's an excuse for not really saying where the creativity lies. So the poet who invokes the muse at the beginning, you know, as Virgil does, as Homer does at the beginning of his epic, as even Lucretius does at the beginning of his epic, he invokes Venus, right? The mother of the race of Troy, etc. That's just a way of putting off the need for an explanation. Oh, it came from divine inspiration. That doesn't tell you. If you believe in divine inspiration, it doesn't tell you how it works. It's what is creativity? I stress that those three headings were none of them intended as an explanation. They were intended to characterize the people who feel uncomfortable about giving an explanation because it's not deductive, because it's not human, because it's not personal. I think it is personal. I think it is intellectual. I think it is I think it's instructive to notice that the highest compliment you could pay to a poet in Latin would be to call the poet doctus, learned. Why? Why is a poet supposed to be learned? I thought a poet is supposed to be inspired. I thought a poet is supposed to be original. What makes a poet capable of being original is that the poet is immersed in a tradition and knows how to depart from the tradition, what needs to be new, what hasn't been said before, what could be said in a new and different way. That's very important. In addition, I think that a creative person, number one, needs to be informed. Number two, needs to be motivated by a problem. I once heard Auden, when he was alive, give a reading of his poetry. And one of the things that Auden said, W.H. Auden, was that where an ordinary reader sees a problem, could be a linguistic problem, could be a problem about meter or rhyme or something, or maybe a word that's in the wrong register and doesn't come out right. The real poet sees those problems as an opportunity. That's an opportunity to do something. That is very important. So creativity, in part, involves problem solving. It involves background. It involves tradition. I gave examples about Picasso's painting of the Demoiselle d'Avignon, and you will learn if you read the book that title of that famous painting was quite euphemistic. There weren't demoiselles, and Avignon reference is to a bordello in Barcelona, not to the city of Avignon in France. But in that painting, where he's asserting the newness of what he wants to do as an artist, he's got figures that are based on African masks. He's got figures that are based on great painters of the great Spanish age of painting. Each of the 5 women who is shown in that painting is given the character of a different style of painting, and he is asserting his originality, in making reference to those and showing how his own more cubistic style and his own style, influenced by all those others but not reducible to any of them, is new and different and remarkable. Working against the backdrop of that tradition, I think that the essence of creativity is synthetic, and by that I mean taking ideas from one realm and transposing them into another realm where they take on a new life and a new meaning. That could be in art, it could be in invention, it could be in medicine. I think that people who are administrators, who are thought only to sort of mechanically implement policies that they're given, I think that that's a misrepresentation of what administrators do. Administrators work creatively all day long. They solve problems that they have never confronted before. And they have to have a new...
Or that they have created.
Well, they don't want to be too
They're very creative at problem creation.
Right,
and solving.
right. But no, I mean a good administrator. But you see what I'm driving at. It involves problem solving. It involves putting together ideas and possibilities in new ways and in productive ways. And I would put the emphasis on production. I don't think it's just novelty. I think it's something useful. And this relates to a criticism that Randy made, where he was saying, oh, hell, you're only referring to past creativity, you've got to refer to present creativity and ongoing creativity. Nice if we can do it. I'm very fortunate to have been able to work with Greg, so in the social process that we engaged in, there was his creativity and my creativity, and we worked together. We came up with something that neither of us would have come up with on our own. That's part of it too. That social alembic in which new and productive ideas emerge. So I think that if I had to say it in a word, I think that creativity is synthetic. Making something new that wasn't there before. I wanted to say, what was the other? Oh, imagination. The word creativity, like the word soul, is a little bit in disuse. Not as badly as the word thou, but almost as badly as the word soul. And the reason is, in this case, it's Kant's fault. Kant did not believe in what had previously been regarded as rational intuitions. In ancient and medieval philosophy, it was thought that the mind, reason, has the ability to recognize, I don't say a priori, I don't say innately, but to recognize inherently true propositions, like equals added to equals are equal. It was recognized that you can't prove those propositions because you'd wind up arguing in a circle if you tried to use them to prove others. They're too basic to be proved. They're recognized in classical philosophy by way of reason, and they are called rational intuitions. Axioms are a good example of that, mathematical and logical axioms. Kant believed that there are no rational intuitions. He differs radically with Spinoza on that question. Spinoza thought that there are rational intuitions. The third kind of knowledge in Spinoza's ethics is all about rational intuitions. Okay? When Kant made that move of rejecting the idea of rational intuitions, Randy brought this out earlier today.
He had to put something in its place.
He had to put something in its place, and he put imagination in its place.
That's what he did, yeah.
He had to put imagination in its place, and later on in the third critique, as Randy pointed out, Kant had the energy, the fuel for imagination to be supplied by ideas of purpose. Okay, that's very good, that's very useful, and it had an amazing effect on the English language. Because when Coleridge went to Germany to study German philosophy, he took a lot of Kant, and he believed as a poet that there was a basic capability of doing creative work, but he doesn't think it could come from reason. Partly because he was a romantic, and partly because Kant had proved that there's no such thing as a rational intuition. So he used the word imagination instead, because imagination was supposed to supply these new forms and these new
Because
structures.
that's what Vico told him.
Fair enough. Fair enough. But you see how imagination did that work. And when when Coleridge came back to England and imbued his friend Wordsworth with that idea, and the two of them supposedly invented Romanticism. Now I could show you that Romanticism goes way, way back before that. But Romanticism in English literature began with Wordsworth and Coleridge when they published lyrical ballads. And they used the word imagination as a substitute and a euphemism for creativity. Okay? And we therefore tend not to use the word creativity, and we speak of people who have imagination, meaning people who are creative. As if the ability to recombine different shapes in your mental visionary were the whole story. That's a misleading explanation. And Coleridge himself believed it, and he believed romantic things. That one of the examples we gave in the chapter is about the composition of Xanadu did Kubla Khan, a stately pleasure-dome decree, where Elf the sacred river ran, in caverns measureless to man, beside a shoreless sea. Coleridge represented that poem, as far as he got with it, came to him in the midst of an opium dream. He woke up from the opium dream and wrote down as much as he could remember, but it was gone, he couldn't get it down. Only problem, as I explained, I shouldn't say that. As we explained in the text of that chapter, they discovered an earlier draft of the same thing. Right? It didn't come to him just because of an opium dream. That's a romantic way of accounting for it. We tell the same story about Kekulé.
Kekulé with the benzene molecule, yeah.
That's right. Kekulé in chemistry.
Dreaming the snakes.
He dreamed that the bugs were dancing in a circle, and that's how he solved the problem of the benzene ring. The chemistry didn't add up unless you tied together the six molecules of the carbon. Only trouble was, Kekulé paid the father of organic chemistry the discovery of the geometry, and it is geometry, of the benzene ring. He told the same story twice at two different dinner parties in a rather different version. Okay? You can read it in the book. So you see what's happening. It was a great story, but it's not what creativity was. And part of the thing you need to know about Kekulé and the discovery of the benzene ring was that Kekulé had a student who told him, look, the chemistry doesn't add up, these carbon bonds need to be both here and there at the same time, the weights weren't right, and so forth. And he was wrestling with that problem. And it didn't occur to him on the subway or the tram car. It didn't occur to him in a dream with their particles dancing around or biting each other's tails. No. It came to him because he was motivated to solve that problem, and he was thinking about how to solve it. It came to him all right, and part of it is mysterious. There's no question about that. But it wouldn't. If somebody else had a dream about snakes biting each other's tails or something like that, it would be just a dream. Kekulé, it had a meaning because it helped him solve that problem. You can read the whole story in the book. Yeah.
Only people can do that. Imagination and
No.
creativity.
Avicenna and Farabi both say that animals have imagination. That's why the sheep. That's why the sheep knows that the wolf is dangerous.
And I'm pretty certain that the recent work on cetaceans, we have pretty solid evidence that at least some species of cetaceans have imagination.
I saw a film, the reason I asked that question, I saw a film of a primate in a gym, and the experimenters purposely put a banana tree just out of the reach of the primate. Also, they put a bench there off to the side. And the primate was jumping and got very frustrated, went over to the other end of the gym and sat in a frustrated, and you could see he looked at the tree and he looked at the bench and he walked over, put the bench by the tree and grabbed it.
I can tell you in the book, Greg and I put a story that the Gestalt psychologists tell. We give a lot of credit to the Gestalt psychologists, and their specialty is imagination. I think it was Kohler told the story about a similar reward, and there was just a pole, not a bench. And if I remember correctly, the ape picked up the bowl and climbed the pole to get the reward. The point being, you could see that magical moment where the light turned on, and you can call it inspiration if you like. You can call it imagination. But it was a creative solution to the problem. I'll give you one more example, which comes from Gestalt psychology, because Gestalt psychology, like the Bauhaus under the Nazis, the Nazis closed the art school of the Bauhaus and the architectural school of the Bauhaus, but one of the Gestalt psychologists, Kelsen, and we quoted at some length, he went into one of these very Germanic classrooms, and he wanted, the children in the classroom had just learned how to calculate the area of a rectangle. You multiply the length by the side. That's a pretty sophisticated thing to do. The idea that these linear numbers could have a meaning in 3 space or in 2 space is itself quite a feat of constructive imagination, if you will. But he asked his students to calculate the area of a parallelogram. And some of them were trying to do it in the same way, and some of them were saying, well, we haven't learned the formula for that, which was true, they hadn't. That was the point of the exercise. And in the Germanic way of teaching, the idea was you memorize the formula and then you apply it, but obviously it didn't apply to the parallelogram. The sides weren't right angles. The visiting educator, Gestalt psychologist, encouraged them to try different things, and they came up with very interesting ideas. And one of the children took a piece of paper on which the parallelogram was drawn, and he cut out the parallelogram, and he joined the 2 ends that were where the angles were. He joined the 2 ends to each other and cut it down the middle, and he calculated the area as though it had been a rectangle, which was a creative way to solve the problem. You see, the kid pictured something. It was imagination in this case, because he pictured what he was going to do and he did it, but he solved it in a way that had not been fed to him. And that was what was important to the Gestalt psychologist who was trying to teach the teacher. He was not trying to teach the kids how to find the area of a parallelogram. He was trying to teach the teacher how to teach, which is a matter of teaching kids how to think, not just how to plug values into a formula. Okay, I think. Thank you for reminding me about that. I meant to talk about that and I didn't, so I'm glad we did. Are we down to the more questions, or is that about it? Somebody online?
I need to check to see if the caterers are here, but in the meantime...
I'm not going to keep people from their dinner. That's the one thing a speaker must never do. Have we about done it?
Yeah.
And that's done it. Thank you very much.